Are we on version 11? Let me see here. Yeah, we're on version 11. Alright. What's up, guys? What's going on? Sorry I'm a little late. Ooh, I've been kind of a scrub today. It's just been like hard to... I'm kind of building this a bit and got taken into a few different directions, but this is part of the exploration process, and yeah, just trying to put it all together for you guys. So I think I do want to keep track of the pauses in here. I think it'll make it easier. Yeah, let's see here. Okay. Oh yeah, that's my internet deal. Okay, actually we use no card. Let's see. See, I hope everyone is well. It's been a good week for me for sure. You know, I was able to hit my hour targets. I don't really have any like goals per se, like goal targets, just time targets. Like if I put in X amount of hours and I put in good effort, I mean that's the maximum I could do, and you know that usually I kind of set that pace, and if I know if I meet those hours that I should be able to do the things that I accomplish whatever I need to accomplish, you know. So that's kind of how I work that angle. But yeah, no, it's been good. I find that I'm really into the brain. I just love the brain. Something about the brain really makes me happy. So focusing on that, especially on natal development, and just to show kind of what are we fundamentally, you know, what gets developed first, and a little bit lower there, yeah, what gets developed first, and how does development occur, and that kind of sets up the platform for, you know, I guess it sets up the platform for the how we're built, you know, like what's the foundation that we're built upon, and you know, I'll say that it's really a foundation of movement. It's a foundation of action, and our perceptions are geared towards, yeah, I guess it's control. Certainly a perception of state in terms of our relationship to ourselves, the representations of ourselves. And we represent the world in terms of distinct objects and a world of opportunity, basically, a world of expectation and desire. You know, we come with a narrative framework. So I'll probably move a little bit more quickly through kind of the intro part, and then try to flesh out the functioning of who we are and how that relates to story, and then eventually how that relates to dopamine. I suspect I'm gonna have to probably redo part one and kind of reconfigure a lot of this, but I kind of just want to get this part a little bit more under my belt, and yeah, probably what I'll end up doing is get as far as I can for this month, and then I'll probably take a month to do some slightly different things, maybe some street preaching type things. That'll be really crazy and exciting. And then I'll come back and I might revamp for the last quarter of the year, just revamp the lecture, redo part one, and really try to just map the whole thing out. But mapping out this part will be really useful, because it'll set up the I guess the goals, the scheduling for part one, how I'll set that up, and then yeah, that'll set the stage for part 2 and 3, which will be how narrative is the fundamental like setup of our nervous systems, of our coordination. You know, basically it's how we coordinate. It's how we coordinate with the world. It's how we conceive of the world. We're a character in a story. We have a setting. We're the character. We have the motivation. Motivation is our connection to the world, and movement is our bridge. I guess movement and desire and movement are kind of the bridge. It's really desire, I guess, and then we determine that action is how we accomplish our desire. So it's, yeah, I'll have to kind of sort out more how that works. So, all right, well, Guys, hello, welcome to version 11 of part 2. So this is the Heroes Lecture part 2, version 11. And man, it's been through so many changes. It'll be fun once I kind of get this to a reasonable point to watch this and watch the earlier versions and see what a difference it makes, you know, all these different revisions and how much it's just transformed. Hopefully for the better. I think it has. I definitely feel better about it. So, but yeah. So, you know, part 1 we discussed this phenomenon called the hero's journey. It is it's constructed by. It was put together by Joseph Campbell, and basically it's kind of an answer to this postmodern angst that we find ourselves in. I guess we're in postmodernism now. I'm not even sure. But it's this idea that it's, you know, it's kind of hard to find a grand narrative, a single narrative for life that explains who we are. And it's interesting that it's narrative that we search for. You know, we instinctively know that it's a narrative that we need. All the religions and mythologies come in the form of narrative. They tell stories. They explain our situation through stories, and it seems like we each have our own different story. But Campbell had something to say about that. He said, okay, sure, I mean, some of the particulars differ. But there is, I think, a general sense that the religions, they tend to point in kind of a similar direction. You know, the ones that are real, shall we say, the ones that are most seriously considered, that have proliferated around the world, have pointed to some kind of morality and some kind of grand purpose for mankind. And Campbell did the hard work of, well, it was a hobby when he was a kid, but he read a number of mythologies and religions from all different kinds of civilizations, from the deep jungle to the lofty, sprawling civilizations of Greece, for example, across huge spans of time, from Sumeria right up to the present day. And I'll be emphasizing that throughout this, that we still tell mythologies today. These are the stories that when you get home from a busy day at work, what do? You flop on the couch and turn on Netflix. Those are the mythologies, and they still carry the same germinating seed, the same narrative patterns as the mythologies of old. And that's what Campbell put together. He noticed that there's these consistent narrative patterns throughout different cultures and different time periods. And there's like a number of different themes that he noticed that weave through all these different stories. And he put them together into a composite. It's a meta-narrative of meta-narratives, you could say. And he called it the hero's journey. And he said this is mankind's one great story. And so it's very interesting because, you know, it's what is, you know, again, the postmodern angst is everyone has their own story. How do I choose? You know, maybe they're all right, maybe they're all wrong. I have no idea, right? And then everyone gets into fights, and it's like this really unattractive scenario. People are killing each other. No, we should love each other. No, my version of we should love each other, you know, and then they kill each other, and it's like, what the hell? So the idea that this narrative has been put together from all people groups, all walks of life, from 7,000 years ago, again, to the very present day, from rough-hewn villages and nomadic jungle tribes, to modern life. We're all telling the same story. This is the consistent narrative pattern that is woven through them all. And so it's certainly, he argues that this is a universal narrative. I mean, kind of by definition, right? If he's pulling it from all these different things. And then he also says that this is a grand narrative, that this narrative can fulfill the deepest, the deepest existential needs of man. That this defines the deepest meaning of our life. And in some sense, it proposes what that is, you know? So this hero's journey, it puts forth three things as a grand narrative, you know? And I kind of feel like I need to frame this a little bit, but yeah, it's like, so this is there's a universal narrative and there's a grand narrative that he argues is the story of mankind. And I'll talk a little bit about what makes it grand, and then we'll talk about, is it true, or is it valid? Is this just like some pipe dream, or does this have like real weight to it? And so what he proposes is grand, is three elements that compose a grand meaning. Because, we wouldn't really have a story where it's like, oh, well, the grand narrative is that mankind is supposed to sit around on a couch all day and do nothing, or we're supposed to eat pizza all day. It's probably something grand. And so the first element is it has to have, well, first of all, it has to be epic. It has to present whatever theme it presents, it has to be done in an epic way, some kind of universal way. And so he says the first element of that is morality. There has to be some grand purpose for moral good, that it involves man overcoming evil, that we are made for something good, something epically good, a triumph of some kind. And in the process of that, the second element is going to be that our part of our meaning, what fulfills us, will have to be the transformation of who we are, that we become our true self, or our higher self, our transcendent self, if you will. So a pursuit of epic moral goodness, some kind of moral triumph. In the process, we become something more. There's some dramatic transformation, and then some victory is attained where we then are able to harness the power of some transcendent force and release it into the world, and that's kind of like saving the world. And this is the story that we keep telling from culture to culture over thousands of years, including our very own. Yeah, you turn on Netflix, that's pretty much what every story contains. Some moral dilemma, some character transformation, and then some sense of renewed knowledge or getting in touch with some greater wisdom that then transforms their world in some way. And this is the story of mankind. This is what we keep seeing everywhere. So he argues that this is the meaning of our lives. This is how we should conceive of our lives. And then if we follow these narrative patterns, that we will experience a deep, deep sense of meaning and fulfillment. Sounds pretty good, right? Wouldn't that be a nice plot to your life? That you're somehow caught in the midst of this epic cosmic battle, that you're the force for good, and that you'll be called to shed who you are in order to become this, this sort of transcendent, the true being of who you are, something like that, right? And then you win some amazing battle, you overcome some adversity, and then now you become the conduit through which the world receives this life-giving energy from this transcendent realm. I mean, what a story, right? It sounds a little crazy, but it is the one that we keep telling. Now, how do we know the story is true? I mean, how can we verify this? Like, what can we say it in today's language? Is there, when we're talking about meaning and fulfillment, this narrative is like purpose, right? It's like what we're supposed to do then, what we've been created to do, essentially. And if that were true, can we see evidence of that in other domains of study, in other disciplines, other ways of analyzing the world? Let's say through a more scientific lens, a more observational lens. Something that's a little more certain and rigorous than just like one guy's sociological survey of multiple cultures. And so what I want to do then is look at, like if we're talking about what we're meant to do, well, that's kind of like survivability, right? That's kind of like how we adapt to the world. If we're fulfilling our purpose of the world, that's like, what is our most adaptive frame? Like, what is the thing that most fits us into the world? And that's kind of like a question of adaptability, which is kind of a question of like, survival of the fittest. In other words, our physiology, right? Like how is our physiology designed? Because if we're meant to be doing this, then shouldn't we see that in how we've been made up? So that's what we want to talk about in part 2 of this lecture. And the first thing we should talk about is, how is it appropriate for narrative to be the thing that defines who we are? Like, is narrative the thing? And let's talk about narrative, and then we're going to talk about how we're put together and how we see narrative within our very physiology. So what is narrative exactly? Well, narrative is synonymous with purpose. Because when you think about what a purpose is, a purpose implies an actor or an agent and then a setting. So it's an agent and a setting. It's someone has to carry out that purpose, and they have to carry that out in a place. So purpose is comprised of character and setting. And that's what a narrative is. A narrative is a character, a setting, and a motivation, a purpose. And all these three elements sort of talk to each other. They're all part of the same kind of sphere, and that sphere is meaning. So meaning is, when we say meaning, we're really talking about three elements. So let's define meaning, right? Meaning is narrative, which is character, setting, and motivation, which is like, who are you? What is the world? And then what's your purpose in the world? Because when you talk about like these deep questions of life, right? These sort of generically, right? What is the meaning of life? Or who am I? What you're really saying is, what is the meaning of life? Well, what is the purpose of life? Like, why are we alive? What's the purpose, right? Purpose, motivation. And then if you say, well, like, who am I, right? Just in the Lion King, he's like, remember who you are, right? He says that to Simba when he's kind of, frolicking around, lost in the jungle. He's run away from his responsibilities, the kingdom, his family, and he gets that message from his father. Remember who you are. Remember your identity. Why? Because that will tell you what you're supposed to do. So it's like, who am I is the same question as why am I? Who am I is like, what's my purpose here, right? That's why you ask these questions. So purpose is synonymous with meaning, and that makes sense because purpose contains you and it contains the world. And it's like if you're having a crisis of meaning, right? Well, it's good to think of meaning this way because that means you could gain new information or new understanding about any three of those elements. Any one of those three elements. You could discover something about yourself where you go, oh my God, this is who I am. Now I know my purpose, right? Now I understand the world better, how I fit in the world better. Or you could say, I never thought of the world this way. Like you discover something about the world that, you fall in love and you go, I never knew that this is what love felt like, that this was in the world. And now I know that my purpose is X, Y, Z, right? So it's like your ability to develop meaning is determined by your ability to conceive of yourself, the world, and your purpose. And any one of those three things could inform the other two. So it's like there's this kind of reciprocal relationship between all those, and that'll become more relevant as we talk about our physiology. But so it makes sense then that narrative would be the thing that we're looking for. So far so good. I mean, Campbell proposes that it's a grand narrative that defines who we are, and that I think that makes sense because a narrative says this is who you are, this is what the world is, and this is your purpose in the world. That's pretty much all you need for meaning right there, man. That's it. I don't think there's anything else. So narrative is what defines us. And right, and so he's proposing that these three elements, the moral element, the transformation, and then the saving of the world, that these comprise the loftiness of who we are. And I think that is probably self-evident. So structurally speaking, structurally the the idea that this narrative is what will define our lives, I think it is plausible. Now, let's turn now to our physiology, and let's talk about how we've been made. Hang on a second. Let's talk about our physiology. And what I want to do is start with how we begin. Like, when we're born, when we're conceived even, the very first thing that is put together is our nervous system. We have an autonomic system and a central nervous system. The central is going to be the brain and the spinal cord, and the autonomic system is going to be all the nerves that flow from there. Now, these nerve endings are like sensors. They're nodes of control, but they're also information nodes. And the ANS and the CNS, they speak to each other. CNS, in some sense, I think probably reports into itself, but the ANS certainly reaches into every part of who we are. It's the first thing that is, I guess, that is constructed as we're an embryo. And it stretches every corner of our body, and it's constantly reporting in. One neurologist says it's having conversations with the other parts of our body, like as we develop the heart and the lungs and all these different things. Now, when we're thrust into the world, when we're born, like, we emerge in a state of pain and vulnerability. Pain and vulnerability. And when you think about it, pain is the announcement that we are separate. That vulnerability, that pain is announcing that we are a separate being. That we are now separate, and we're in a state of, you could say, need, a state of desire. Because we're filled with this sensation that something's not right. Our nervous system is telling us, where are we? We don't know where we are. We're suddenly thrust out of this perfect environment, the womb. And the fact of our individuality, our separateness, is announced through pain. And so this, again, the same neurologist says that these feelings that we get from our nervous system is the announcement of consciousness. And it's the beginning of the awareness of self, which is kind of like the representation of self, the reflection of self. So that's kind of like, that's our emergence into the world. And you could say that this is where the hero is born in some sense, because, as we said, the narrative is what? It's a character, a setting, and a motivation. You know, character and motivation go together, because in some sense, who you are, especially in those first moments when you're born, who you are is pain, really, at that moment. It's confusion, pain, just, you probably wouldn't be able to vocalize that, but it's this sense of utter disorientation, and this instinctual sense that you're helpless. And immediately from the time that you're born, you start to look out into the world, and you instinctively look towards your mother's face. From the time that you're born, they put you into her arms, and you're looking for a face. And it's one of the first things you're able to do is to recognize a face. And in fact, you can, from almost like the first hour, you can mirror facial expressions. Your sensory motor skills are developed to the point where you can, like, if someone like goes like this, you can shape your mouth like an O as well. So, in some sense, you emerge like a dancer. Like, you're already trying to coordinate yourself with the world. And you have these two parts to yourself. So you have your central nervous system, which is your brain and spine, and that's the voluntary part of yourself. I mean, not exactly. Like, it's actually your motor, premotor, and prefrontal cortexes. These are the conscious parts of yourself. And these are all built out on perception and movement. Well, they're built out on a platform of movement, because what's happening is that you're filled with a sense of need, right? And basically your mother is holding you, and you're experiencing need, and she's trying to fill the need. You need the warmth, she holds you. You need food, she breastfeeds you. What else do you need? That's pretty, so all these different things. And what's happening is, as she's taking you through those experiences, is that you're learning that movement is the primary way in which you interact with fulfilling your needs, because the breastfeeding is a coordinating aspect. There's sensory motor with that. Your communication with your mother, the facial expressions, you begin to piece together different action sequences that premeditate the fulfillment of desire. When you cry, she picks you up, right? Crying is an action. That's a movement. And so your brain is very, very busy. Like newborns up to infants, they're able to remember and store action sequences and their resulting consequences. And so that's kind of like developing in the motor cortex and the premotor and the prefrontal cortex, that you're starting to abstract out actions. Like you're memorizing, and you can visualize these different sequences. And it's called episodic memory that you're developing, where you can actually that you're able to replay, and I think you replay it very quickly. They call it high-speed memory synaptic algorithmic something or other. You're replaying action sequences to store the result, and so you associate it with a specific need. Everything is arranged around your constellation of needs that you feel inside of you. And so it's like, what's happening then? You're constructing this world through your perceptions, and you're building up a library of expectations, a library, and a kind of like a, what is it, like a list or something, like a playbook of algorithms, of different motor algorithms, primarily seen in terms of primarily encoded in action, stored in your motor cortex, like different movements, different actions, different facial expression, different sounds that you make, that you're just intuiting, like you can't even speak yet, but that's what your brain is doing. That's what your nervous systems are doing. And like, so consciousness is announced to you through pain. Pain is essentially encoded desire, but it just doesn't have, the desire doesn't have the target of fulfillment yet, so it's kind of a very low resolution sensation until your mom starts fulfilling your desires and showing you how to fulfill those desires. And then what you're doing is you're mapping events and actions onto the fulfillment of those desires. So it's like you are connected to the world through desire or pain. They're kind of the same. It's sort of the same thing. Pain is the announcement of a need, and that's done through your nervous system. And it's also, and then it's like coordinated with your perceptions. And basically, like, perceptions is as much about what's coming in as it's what's going out, because you have to interpret. There's an interpreter, and how does that interpretation work? It's interpreted based on how well it fulfilled your desires. That's the criteria of interpretation. And so it's like, you need to discern your mother's face. Why? Because you instinctively know that she is the one that fulfills your desires. But she, it fulfills a dual purpose, because you need connection. You have an instinct for connection. And so that connection with your mother's face and that reciprocation, your mirroring, right? That in and of itself is a fulfillment of desire. And then I'm like looking at my mother right now. And then her ability to get you the things that you need, so your ability to communicate with her, right? Like, everything is centered around, it's encoded and remembered and based upon your ability to fulfill your desires. Your autonomic nervous system is developing impressions of you. it's interesting. Your perception of the world is through the discernment of shapes and the meaning of those shapes, which is defined by their which is defined by their ability for you to fulfill your desires. It's designed by how it relates to the fulfillment of your desire. Is it an obstacle in the way? Is it a threat to you? Is it the target of your desire, right? That's how you determine meaning of objects. But in terms of your own internal state, you're not aware of the different objects inside you. What you are aware of, though, is your overall state, the state of your physiology. So your interoceptions, your inner senses, is constructing an overall perception of state. And you can think of it as like an arousal state. And what it's trying to determine is what you're ready for. And also, it's determining overall functioning. And then it's determining readiness. Like, are you ready to expend energy? What types of actions are you prepared to undertake? Like, do you have the energy state to potentiate certain actions? Also, it's determining, like, what are the needs of the system? How do we maintain functioning? And so that would be like the food, like you need to eat food, you need to drink water. I would say also probably emotional needs is somewhere in there too. Like you need time for a hug or maybe you need a nap, right? It's determining those needs. But I would say as you develop, you're developing higher and higher and more abstract goals. Your goal states become more sophisticated. You want to laugh. You want to play. You're curious. You want to explore. You're looking for, you're kind of vaguely becoming aware of the world, and that's instilling in you, it's stimulating in you the awareness of other needs. Your needs become more complex and abstract and sophisticated. And so what's happening there? You're developing, you're improving this map of self, this conception of self. Because you are a network of needs. Preference is another way of saying needs, how you fulfill your needs. And then at the same time, you're building out this map, this interpretive map of the world, which is based around your desires. And the coordination of your desires to the world is perceived from a motor perspective, through movement. And so basically, like, you could say action or movement, everything that you do is perceived in terms of fulfillment of a goal. And so, like, you've heard of flight or fight, right? Which is kind of like move forward, stay still, or move backwards, evade, or, right? Your platform of emotions is essentially built upon that platform of movement. And so it's like you get the rewarding emotions when you perceive forward motion. Forward motion is just an association of moving closer towards a goal. You're moving closer towards the fulfillment of a goal. That's moving forward. And then if you're moving away from a goal, that's considered moving backwards, which is like evading, and that's generally associated with negative emotions. Or standing still could be some kind of fear response. It could also be a directional change. It could be goal selection or action selection. There's so much about the brain that's dedicated to the eventual execution of an action. Because when you think about it, doesn't just arise from you do without thinking, you're just acting. I mean, there's the reflex actions and but really action begins with the premeditation of action, the abstract conception of action, the history of the results of the actions that you took. What were the sequences? What were the circumstances? The signaling events of different outcomes of fulfillment or punishment. Some kind of like, did you get the reward, or was there success or failure in your desire to attain a reward? And so it's like you have these different triggers, like you interpret again, like these events, you interpret them in terms of your ability to apprehend a reward. Um, yeah, I was gonna say that. Right, you receive triggering events that alerts you to the right action sequences that will coordinate you to those events, that will synchronize you properly with the incoming event, such that you're able to gain a reward. You're able to accomplish fulfillment, the successful acquisition, the successful collection of a reward. Everything is arranged according to your desires to fulfill a reward. Everything is arranged around the ability to everything is arranged around your goal, around your purpose. Everything is evaluated and prioritized in terms of its ability to move you towards a purpose. You're trying to move forward. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And so, so let's think about that more. So you're built upon this platform of movement. You're building out your motivations, right? This network of needs. You're beginning to prioritize those motivations. You have more abstract desires now, the desire to play, the desire to explore. As you get older, you have a desire to become something in the world. You have a desire to connect to your peer group. You have all these complex interactions with society. And so it's your ability then to properly identify and prioritize your targets, your needs, such that you are most adapted to the world. And you could say that's measured by meaning and fulfillment. All that is communicated to you through your nervous system. So essentially then, like, you're comprised into two parts. You have your autonomic nervous system. You have your sensory perception, right? And those are more or less automatic, that you don't have a lot of control over those, but you are aware of them. And so these senses come into you. But then you have your voluntary part, which is located in the prefrontal cortex, which is essentially kind of like the entire thing is premotor. It's there to perform action, to eventually potentiate correct action. And this prefrontal cortex, it's a coordinating, it's like a coordinating organ, a coordinating part of your brain. Because a lot of parts of your brain, like facial recognition, for example, are modular. They have a singular function, and it's best to understand them in terms of that one particular ability, even though that information will be used in potentially a complex array of actions. But like the elements inside the prefrontal cortex, like the orbital or especially the dorsolateral, are coordinating elements where they take in multiple streams of information and then integrate them into a coherent structure. You could call it a narrative, such that you're able to prioritize different goal states, different end goal. Yeah, and they call them goal states. So different end goals, like I want to feel connected. I want to be in a state of meaning. Those are maybe sort of the most abstract, but it could just be like, I want to get this job because I want to get a family, because I want to get right. You were constructed of I forgot to talk about the nested narratives part. Yeah. So, right. So this prefrontal cortex is essentially a coordinating. It's essentially a coordinating device. It's a coordinating instrument, and it's constantly in communication with your different nervous systems, the autonomic and the central. And your autonomic is specifically connected to your heart, your lungs, and your stomach. And it's like that pretty much comprises your overall arousal state. I mean, think of your stomach when you feel sick, right? All these things tell you what your potential for action is. And that's all information that's important when you're trying to prioritize different goals and trying to prioritize them over time. So if you're really like, you're sensing in your stomach that you're really hungry, well, maybe you shouldn't write that paper, which, the paper is probably more important than the food in some sense, but it's the food that allows you to write the paper. So it's like you got to eat that, right? This all happens in your prefrontal cortex, especially the dorsolateral. You have all these different rules that are based on this, that are based on an arranged prioritization of goals and end goal states. And these processes all happen sort of simultaneously. You're trying to assess all this information, you're trying to prioritize the needs that you have, and then you're accessing your history, right? Your hippocampus, and then inside your motor cortex, you have these different motor algorithms, this storehouse of algorithms, and you're flipping through. You're using your episodic memory to flip through like different sequences, different, like almost like film. You're running film to determine what action sequences will be the most appropriate and at what time. So you're able to stack. This is called making plans. It's a very complicated process to make plans, and a lot of this happens in the orbital and the dorsolateral, this dorsal cortex. It's probably simplest to think of them as rules. Like these are different rule states. These are different rules. And so it's like you're building, your visual cortex is generating an interpretive map. I mean, a lot of perception comes from the inside out. It's electrical impulses that are translated in the brain, that are integrated, but it's orchestrated with a conductor, like there's an interpreter there, and that's going to be your frontal cortex. And it's based on past history and expectations, and so it generates this kind of 3D model of the world. And it's completely, and there's some kind of link between action and world building. You're interpreting the world in terms of how you can move through it, and also in terms of targets that exist within the world. And they can be abstract targets like a job. It's not just like you have to physically move, but again, the perception is movement. If you're performing actions that move you closer towards the goal, that reduce the entropy between you and an end goal state, which is, I have this new job, that's kind of like a state of being, then you get rewarded with good emotions. Your nervous system rewards you. So yeah, I mean, we can talk about, like the technicalities of how this works. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this is where they determine a lot of planning happens. I don't think it's the highest level of planning, but it's like if you already have an end goal state in mind, like a high level one, like get that job, or it's like, should you go to work or should you skip work and go to the park instead, right? These are sort of higher level abstract goals. Once you've kind of established a goal, or this happens all simultaneously, but different goals will then be made up of a number of different rules. You can call them rule sets, and the rule sets occur in your dorsolateral cortex, this left dorsal cortex. The dorsal cortex is in touch with an area of the brain that connects you to your body, and that's your insula. The insula has information reporting into it from these three areas: the heart, the lungs, and the stomach. And this is what communicates to you sort of like the level of arousal state. And your prefrontal cortex, this dorsolateral, is able to also communicate back through. There's a reciprocal, like a conversation that happens between your dorsolateral and your insula. And this is really good to know, because it's like the only way that you can like the only way that you can visualize out action, to try to optimize action, to access the hippocampus, to run that episodic memory so that you can visualize the possible consequences of different actions and thereby optimize, because you're always looking at a situation and trying to compare it to a past situation. And you're trying to assess the different action patterns and then what their outcome was. And it's like this sort of complicated process. But the only way you can do that is in a state of stillness. And so, like, when you receive information from the insula, sometimes this information that you're getting, the senses can be very strong. You can think of it, again, fight or flight. That the nervous system, again, built upon a platform of movement, and it's essentially non-reflective. It's primitive in the sense that all it is it's sensing and reacting to stimuli. It's a reaction machine. And you know what happens when you just operate out of your reaction. Sometimes you become kind of unhinged. You become dysregulated, where the actions that are recommended by the insula are disproportionate or inappropriate to the actual context of which you're in. And most of the time this is the case. So it's like your prefrontal, this dorsolateral, is able to send calming signals via the vagus nerve back down. I guess it doesn't go through the insula. Back down through to your autonomic centers, this heart, lungs, and stomach. But it takes time to do that, and so this is sort of like the biological backing for patience. You know, this is why patience is important, because you gotta stop and like run the plays, and then a lot of the times actually you have to choose against what your autonomic system is telling you. It's a pretty wild experience. You know, we do it all the time, but sometimes it can just be like, I'm going against every single thing that I know, and that could be construed as like spiritual growth. But anyway, so like your dorsolateral is this contextualized rule setting device, and it's able to match stimuli to past context because it is in contact with your hippocampus. And so it's like if you walk into a bank, well, you know that it's not like a football stadium. And so you're applying that very complicated social rule set. And and the construction of a persona. Yeah, that's true. I forgot about that. Yeah. And so what you're doing is you're constructing this persona, right? Yeah, we got to factor that in. So they have this experiment called the Stroop task, and this kind of illustrates how it all works. And the Stroop task is on a very rudimentary level. They have these people sit down and they read off all these flashcards. And there's just simple words written on it, and they're, barn, house, fox, car, whatever it is. And then at some point they say, you know what, instead of reading off the words, what I want you to do is tell me the color that the words are written in. And so what happens is they have to pause, because as I said, like when you're changing direction, that's a change of rule set that the system has to stop and access and rearrange. Yeah, it's rearranging your physiology around this new goal, essentially. And calming signals are sent, there's that pause, and then they go, okay, and they start reading off the colors of the words. There's always a pause, though. And this kind of explains the action of this dorsal cortex, that it's this coordinating device. The prefrontal consciousness is essentially a coordinating device. It's premeditating movement. It's accessing the episodic memory. It's running the plays. And then it's mobilizing the physiology in order to execute whatever action algorithms that you've selected in the motor cortex. So that's kind of how this prefrontal, how this left dorsolateral is interacting. It's taking information from the insula. Obviously, it's taking all the information from your senses. It's interpreting them according to past memory, but it generally arranges things such that it'll facilitate the accomplishment of a goal, the identification of a target, and then the the identification of a target, and I guess you could say the identification of a pathway towards the target. The development of a route, I guess you identify the proper route. Yeah, you have to identify the target and then identify the proper route. It's identification of the target and it's pathing towards it. You arrange the world such that you can accomplish that. It's all about it's all about prescribing the correct movement sequence. Prescribing and coordinating the correct movement sequence. And so in that sense, you're building this map of movement. Everything is constructed on movement and then perceived movement towards a goal, towards or away from a goal, and then your emotions respond accordingly. And your autonomic nervous system is constantly probing who you are to help you identify and prioritize the desires that you have, usually in the form of pain, some kind of pain, right? So, and it punishes you, rewards you according to how well you perform that process, the identification, the prioritization, and then the pathing, and then the action sequencing, which is the pathing of goal fulfillment. And that's really the carrying out of a story. That's a story. Now, what's interesting about how the involuntary parts of your body work, sort of the basic movement of your body, you could say that, what would you call that? I guess you would call that the involuntary parts of your body. Like your motor cortex, it generally works unconsciously because the movement patterns are stored algorithmically, and when they're fired off ballistically, meaning like you just initiate it and then you go. Just walking is kind of like a ballistic movement. I think that's right. Ballistic? I don't know. Is that true? Walking is kind of like this ballistic movement. And so so in some sense you kind of have these two parts to yourself. These two personas. One of them is the one that contemplates, premeditates, envisions, and then selects, optimizes, selects. And then you have the one that just reacts. And the one that just reacts, like a good example of how the kind of the character of it is that, so you can suppress different parts of the brain. You can suppress your prefrontal cortex through like a magnet stimulation. And what happens then is that the motor cortex kind of runs on its own. And the result is that you're actually able to perform at an extremely high level from a sensory motor coordination perspective. And so that if I hand you a gun and tell you to shoot a bunch of targets, if I suppress your prefrontal and you're operating just from your motor cortex, then you're going to nail every target really quickly. You become like this virtuoso. Just one problem. I can't tell you what targets to hit and what not to hit. I can't say only hit the yellow ones, don't hit the red ones. Because why? That's an abstract rule. That rule would be processed in the prefrontal cortex, in your consciousness. But the automatic reactions is kind of this low level it's kind of conscious, but it's low level. And so that's why it's so important, like if you're in these very high arousal states, or very low, right? Like where either it's depression or rage, and you're just working off the information from these very primal states, which is kind of the operation of your autonomic nervous system, then you're not going to have a highly differentiated view of the world. I got to listen to this one a lot. Your view of the world is going to be fairly again, platform of movement. Should I move forward, attack? Should I stand still? Or should I retreat? And the answer almost always in that situation should be stand still, dude. Stand still, because that's when you start to access your hippocampus and start running that episodic memory where you're running the plays again. What did I do? What did I do last time? What happened? And then you're also accessing your dorsolateral cortex, because you're trying to understand what the contextualized rule set is. This is a rule change. And basically these are all just the technical pieces of a story, where it's like you're building out these different personas, right? Right, different personas. You're building out these different personas. You're running these different personas through an abstract film, right, based on memory. Your predictive modeling, right? There's so many pieces I have to put in here. You're predictively modeling out the future. That's what making plans is. You're trying to envision the future, and you're basing that on your memory. And so you're taking some expectation that you had from the past, and you're trying to evaluate the closest and similarity to the situation that you're presented with in the future, which is inherently unknown. And what that does is it helps you select and optimize different action algorithms, and helps you coordinate it with the expected events, with expected future events. So you have to time these actions, you have to optimize them and then time them. And then when you do that, your autonomic nervous system is going to be paying attention to see how well you performed. Your different nervous systems will see how well you performed, and then it'll store that into your memory, whether it was a success or a failure, or anything in between. You know, it's a very nuanced, it's a very nuanced capture process, I guess you could say. Woo. Okay, so all that to say is that we're storytelling. We come out of the womb telling stories. Story is a way in which we coordinate ourselves. That whole process is basically storytelling. That we build up a persona that's centered around a motivation, because a motivation implies character and setting. Different motivations call out different personas. Change persona on different levels. Different personas call out different motivations. And then you tell a story in your, like, episodic memories, like you tell a story about what happened last time, and then you try to compare that story to the story that you are predicting that's happening now. But you don't know the ending to that story, because every story is a little bit different. We're always in a different point in time. And you're always estimating. You're always predicting. You're also predicting the internal state of who you are. Everything is a prediction. Everything is a story, basically. It's a narrative that you're trying to accurately pinpoint, but you don't directly know exactly how things are going. Everything is indirect. Your brain does not directly see things. Your brain doesn't hear things, right? It's just, these are electrical impulses that your brain then interprets. And so perception is an active, process where your consciousness is arranging the senses as you receive them into an interpretive framework, which is a narrative. Well, it's an interpretive framework centered around the fulfillment of your goals. So it's a world building and also character building process that's built in relation to a purpose. And so it tries to arrange everything in order to facilitate the fulfillment of a goal. And that's how you perceive the world. And the goals are complex, they're myriad and complex, because we have an instinct for pleasure. Anywhere where you feel pain or a desire for pleasure, That's essentially a goal, and that's how you arrange the world according to your pains and your pleasures, essentially. The things that you want and things that you don't want. It's all constructed according to the constellation, your internal universe of desires. You're building a setting for your world. Everything is a story. Everything is story building. Narrative lives at the center of who we are. It lives at the very center of our physiology. Our ability to tell an accurate narrative, that is, our ability to properly perceive the world, accurately perceive the world, the accuracy, our ability to perceive the world, our ability to represent ourselves, to construct the proper persona, our ability to identify and prioritize different needs is determined by how well we were able to satisfy those desires, because we might have a need and we misidentify the target of our need. So once we acquire the target, the need remains unfulfilled, and then your autonomic nervous system essentially punishes you. You're penalized for expending energy towards a target that did not meet the need, and so you experience disappointment, frustration. Also, this persona that you spun up, all the resources dedicated. All the resources dedicated to the fulfillment of this need have basically, in some sense, been wasted. I mean, failure is as important as success in some sense. Now you've collected some information about the world, about that desire and how it relates to the world, that it doesn't connect to that particular target, or you may have learned that the action sequences that you undertook were not the proper sequences, or maybe you coordinated them wrong in time, that you just didn't time them properly. Again, that's an assessment that you're trying to evaluate and then adjust. What will you do differently? What will the character do differently? What's the new persona then that you have to construct? How should you center your physiology in such a way that your next attempt will have a higher likelihood of success? What are you missing that you did not acquire the goal? So, man. So yeah, right. So our ability to adapt is centered around narrative. So on a physiological level, then narrative is absolutely the correct way to conceive of our ability to adapt in the world. And you could say adaptation is measured by meaning and fulfillment, because that seems to be the thing that people want the most. They want to have a sense of meaning and fulfillment. And that seems to be prioritized. That's why we pursue love and family and money and success and status, because we want that feeling of fulfillment, of significance. So narrative is how our physiology does that, and so that it would make sense then that if we're able to better able to what? To identify the nature of the desire, to know what it is that we need to target, to identify the correct action sequences to acquire the target, then that would allow us to adapt better, to reap that end goal, to achieve the end goal state of feeling meaningful. Right? Clear as mud. So. Right, so then improving our narrative is the same thing as improving the the desired target match, and then also the bridge in between, which is action. So that has to do with our understanding of the world, our understanding of ourself, and then our ability, and then our understanding of the correct sequences necessary in order to, and our ability to coordinate, to translate those desires into movement, to enact movement. That we are essentially movement machines guided by a purpose, right? All right, guys, thanks so much. As you say, you know, this is definitely a work in progress. We're on version 11. I suspect we might get to version 20 by the time this month is up. So, actually, no, we won't, because only a few more weeks. But, yeah, so, hey, we'll keep practicing, and I think it's getting better. I think it's coming together. Yeah, little by little, but so.